Okay, in this video I'm just going to run through the entire worksheet, and so you can use this video to check your answers. So I'm just going to start from the top. I'm going to go all the way through, and you should be able to also print out this this entire worksheet already completed, so you can just check that way. But this is just another way to check. It's just if you wanted to, I'll just run through the whole thing. So if A is 3 and B is 4, when I add them I get 7. When I multiply them I get 12. If A is 5 and B is 5, I add them to get 10, multiply to 25. 6 and 2 add to 8 and they multiply to 12. Negative 3 and 4, add them. 3 bad guys, 4 good guys, that's 1 good guy. Multiply them. Negative times positive is a negative 12. 5 and negative 7. 5 positive, 7 negatives, add them to get 2 negatives, multiply them. Positive times negative, negative 35. 3 and negative 4 add to negative 1 and they multiply to negative 12. And then on to these guys. A negative 1 and a positive 1. If you add them, you get 0. You multiply them, you get negative 1. So negative 2 and positive 2, they add to 0, multiply to negative 4. Negative 5 and negative 5, they add to negative 10, and they multiply to positive 25, because it's a negative times a negative. 3 negatives and 3 more negatives make 6 and 3 more negatives make 6 negatives, and when I multiply them, negative times negative gives positive 9. Again, negative 2 and negative 7 add to negative 9, but they multiply to positive 14. Negative 5 and negative 4 add to negative 9 and multiply to positive 20. Okay, so moving on to here. What two numbers multiply to 8 but add to 6? Okay, so what I can do is I can take the 8 and list the pairs of factors to help me out. It's 1 times 8, 2 times 4, and are there any others? No. And it's 1 and 8 adds to 9, 2 and 4 adds to 6, so 2 and 4 are going to work there. You could also write it as 4 and 2 because it doesn't matter. It's addition and multiplication can be switched around any way you like. It's commutative. 4 and 2 make 6, 2 and 4 added make 6. 4 times 2 gives 8, 2 times 4 gives 8. So you can switch those around, it doesn't matter. Now, what two numbers add to 9 multiply to 8? The answer is 1 and 8. And again, if you wanted to write that as 8 and 1, that would also be correct. Any of these numbers, A and B, can be switched around, it doesn't matter, right? Okay, so what two numbers multiply to 12 and add to 7? Well, 12 is 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4, and are there any others? These are all the pairs of factors of 12. Which of these pairs is going to add to 7? So it's going to be 3 and 4, right? Or 4 and 3, same thing, right? Which of these pairs, and here, what numbers multiply to 12 but add to 13? So it's going to be 1 and 12, or 12 and 1, same thing. 1 and 12, 12 and 1, right? Now, what two numbers multiply to 30 and add to 11? Well, 30 is 1 times 30, 2 times 15, 3 times 10, 4 doesn't go into 30, 5 times 6, and these are all of the pairs of factors of 30. Now, out of these pairs, which of them adds to 11? Well, 3 and 10 adds to 13, that doesn't work. 2 and 15 adds to 17. 5 and 6 add to 11, and they multiply to 30. 2 and 15 add to 17 and multiply to 30, right? Now on to these guys. What two numbers multiply to 1 but add to 2? 1 is 1 times 1. Those are the only pairs of factors of 1. And so the answer is 1 and 1, because 1 and 1 add to 2 and multiply them, you get 1, right? How about 4? 4 is 1 times 4 or 2 times 2, but 1 and 4 adds to 5, but 2 and 2 adds to 4. So 2 and 2 works there, right? Positive 2 and positive 2. Okay, how about these guys? 9 is 1 times 9 or 3 times 3, but 3 and 3 add to 6, so that works there. 3 is 1 times 3. So what two numbers multiply to 3 and add to 4? The answer is 1 and 3. What two numbers multiply to 5 and add to 6? Well, 5 is just 1 times 5. And so 1 and 5, or 5 and 1, they add to 6, they multiply to 5. And again, it doesn't matter which way to write it. You could write 1 and 5, or 5 and 1, same thing, right? Okay, moving on to this row. What two numbers multiply to negative 6 and add to 1? Well, let me list the factors of 6. 1 times 6, 2 times 3. And we're dealing with negatives here. And notice that the two numbers multiply to a negative. A negative times a positive gives a negative. So we want to think about, so we can add negatives and positives. So we could do, you can do positives and negatives on these. So I mean, you can have like a -2 and a -3, or a +1, -6, all that stuff. But what if I was to put positive or negatives onto these? How would I manufacture two numbers multiplying to -6 and adding to +1? Well, if you play around with it and mess around with it, you should find, I hope, that if you get a -2 and a +3, see that? -2 and +3. These guys add to +1 when you add them, but when you multiply them, negative times positive is negative, right? So what two numbers multiply to -6 and add to -1? If you play around with that, you should find it's actually +2 and -3, because if you add them, see, it's 2 positives and 3 negatives make 1 negative. 2 positives and 3 negatives make 1 negative. And when I multiply them, I get -6, right? Now, what two numbers multiply to +6 and add to -5? Well, again, the pairs of factors are 1 and 6 and 2 and 3, right? And they multiply to a positive number, but they add to a negative number. That might give you a hint that both of them ought to be negative, because two negatives multiplied are going to give a positive number, right? But two negatives added will give a negative number. And so if you play around with that, you should find it's actually -2 and -3. These guys add to -5 and they multiply to positive. Alrighty, so what two numbers add to -1 and multiply to -12? The first thing you might want to do is list the pairs of factors of 12. 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4, right? And what two numbers multiply to 12 and add to -1? One trick is to try to see, look, is there a difference of 1 here, right? Because if they multiply to negative, one of them is a positive, right? And one of them's a negative. So we know that much, right? And is there anything here that gives us a difference of 1? Like between 1 and 12 is a difference of 11, between 2 and 6 is a difference of 4, but between 3 and 4 is a difference of 1. So for two numbers to add to -1, how about we make it +3 and -4? See, those guys are going to add to -1 and multiply to -12. And similarly with this one, what two numbers multiply to -12 and add to +1? They're going to be a positive and a negative, and a difference of 1. This time let's try +4 and -1, because look, if you, or -3, I mean, because this time if you add them, you get +1. If you multiply them, -12, right? Okay, similarly here, they multiply to -12, they add to -4, so it's got to be a positive and a negative number. A difference of 4, let's look at 2 and 6. Let's try -6, +2. And again, you can always just write two numbers down and just check it. Just try it, see if it works. When I add them, I get -4. When I multiply them, -12, right? Two numbers that multiply to +12 and add to -13. If they multiply to give a positive and they add to give a negative, you're looking at two negative numbers, right? Negative times negative gives positive. Negative times negative gives positive, and if you add two negatives, you get a negative. Now look at your possibilities. 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. What do you think? Seems like a 1 and a 12, right? So a -1 plus -12 gives -13, and when I multiply them, I get +12. Now we've got a bunch of 15s here. Now factors of 15, 1 times 15, 3 times 5, and those are all of our pairs of factors. What two numbers multiply to positive 15 and add to negative 16? Well, if they multiply to a positive and add to a negative, they must both be negative. And what about negative 1 and negative 15? See, those guys are going to add to negative 16 but multiply to positive 15, right? Next one, I've got to multiply to negative 15 and add to negative 2. Well, let's see. If they multiply to negative, one of them must be positive, one must be negative, right? If they add to negative 2, the negative needs to be a higher magnitude, basically. So how about, look at 3 and 5. They've got a difference of 2 between them, right? How about try the negative 5 and the positive 3? Because those guys are going to add to negative 2, but multiply to negative 15, right? Now here again, they multiply to negative 15, so one must be positive and one negative if it's going to multiply to give a negative, right? They add to positive 2. So there's a difference of 2 between them. Look at 5 and 3. How about positive 5 and negative 3? These guys add to positive 2 and multiply to negative 15, right? Now we've got a whole bunch of 30s here. Let's list pairs of factors of 30. 1 times 30, 2 times 15, 3 times 5. No, that's not going to work. Sorry, 3 times 10. 5 times 6. Right, those are all the pairs of factors of 30. So we're going to use those pairs to figure out this stuff. So if they multiply to positive 30 and add to negative 31, the two numbers must actually be negative. Because that's the only way you're going to get to see negative times negative, positive, negative plus negative, negative, right? So it's got to be both negative. And it's got to be what? Negative 1 and negative 30. Because those guys add to negative 31 but multiply to positive 30. And again, just to remind you, you could write that as, you know, negative 30 and negative 1. It doesn't matter which way you put it. Like I said, it could be negative 30 and negative 1. It doesn't have to be, it's all the same. Negative 30 and negative 1 will also add to negative 31 and will also multiply to positive 30. Right? Okay, so they multiply to positive 30, they add to negative 17. Multiplying to a positive and adding to a negative means they're both negative. And they add to negative 17. So look at the 2 and 15. What's 2 plus 15? That's 17. So how about negative 2 and negative 17? Negative 15 rather. They add to negative 17. They multiply to positive 30, right? Okay. So moving on, they multiply to 30, and they add to negative 11. That is in fact negative 5 and negative 6, because they add to negative 11 and they multiply to positive 30. Now, multiplying to negative 30 and adding to positive 1. If they multiply to a negative, one must be positive, one must be negative. They have a difference of 1. If you look at the pairs of factors, which has a difference of 1? Like 2 and 15 have a difference of 13. 3 and 10 have a difference of 7. But 5 and 6 have a difference of 1. So we ought to focus on 5 and 6. And if I had a positive 6 and a negative 5, that would be 5 good guys. Sorry, 6 good guys, 5 bad guys. And those would add to positive 1 and multiply to negative 30, right? Next one, they multiply to negative 30 but add to negative 1. Again, they multiply to a negative, so it's a positive and a negative. They add to negative 1. So how about this time a negative 6 and a positive 5? Because that's 6 bad guys and 5 good guys. Those add to negative 1 but multiply to negative 30. They multiply to negative 30 and add to negative 7. The two numbers must be different signs, first of all, because they got to multiply to give a negative. And look at, what is the difference of 7 here? 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, right? That's a difference of 7. So how about negative 10 and positive 3? Add to negative 7 and they multiply to negative 30. And then for this one, they multiply to negative 30, so it's a positive and a negative. They add to positive 7, so we're going to do a positive 10 and a negative 3. Those guys add to positive 7 and multiply to negative 30. So now we're looking at two numbers that multiply to negative 9 and add to 0. So the factors of 9 are, 1 times 9, 3 times 3. Now they must multiply to a negative, so we need a positive number and a negative number. And the numbers must add to 0. So how about a positive 3 and a negative 3? If you add them, 3 good guys, 3 bad guys make 0. If you multiply them, positive 3 times negative 3, negative 9, right? Two numbers that multiply to negative 4 and add to 0. Well, the factors of 4 are 1 times 4 and 2 times 2. They multiply to a negative, so one must be positive and one must be negative. And they add to 0. So how about positive 2 and negative 2, right? These guys add to 0 and multiply to negative 4. And again, just a reminder, you can write it like negative 2 here and positive 2 here. It doesn't matter, right? Because you can switch addition and multiplication, right? Okay, two numbers that multiply to negative 1 and add to 0. 1 is 1 times 1. Remember, it's 1 times 1. So if you had a positive 1 and a negative 1, these guys would add to 0 and multiply to negative 1. So two numbers that multiply to 9 and add to negative 6. 9 is 1 times 9 or 3 times 3. And two numbers that would multiply to a positive and add to a negative, they both have to be negative. Because negative times negative gives positive. And if you had negative 3 and negative 3, if you add them, that makes negative 6. Multiply them, positive 9. So two numbers that multiply to 4 and add to negative 4. 4 is 1 times 4 or 2 times 2. And the two numbers must multiply to a positive and add to a negative, so they both must be negative. So try negative 2 and negative 2. Because these guys will multiply to positive 4, but when you add them you get negative 4. And finally, what two numbers multiply to positive 1 and add to negative 2? Well, 1 is 1 times 1, remember. And the two numbers must multiply to give a positive and add to give a negative, so they should both be negative. And funny enough, it's negative 1 and negative 1. Because when I add them together, one bad guy and one bad guy, I get two bad guys. And when I multiply them, negative 1 times negative 1, I get positive 1. So that's the entire sheet filled out, and you should be able to print it off from Canvas as well if you want to check it that way. But I hope this video was helpful, and let me know if you need help.